Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. My presentation will not be about something directly linked to credit management, but is more has as a purpose to give you an overview of the environment in which you are developing your activities, which means essentially the political, economic and financial environment. And as you all know, of course, that has a direct link with the results and how you organize your credit management. We are living in a very confusing world. And also I would like to ask you, keep your voting device ready, because as in any true democracy, it will be up to you to decide what is the economic environment. So that's a good solution for an economist. It's up to you. So if your forecast is wrong, it's your problem. So let's start with the confusion in our world. Confusion is all about we are uncertain, we don't know what will happen, we don't understand exactly all the risks. But if you look at the reality of the economic development and the forecasts, it seems all quite under control. This is the latest IMF, International Monetary Fund, forecasts of October last month. And what they forecast is world economic growth 2013 was a relatively bad year, but not a disaster. 2014 more or less stability, and next year more growth. If you look at the US, no crisis at all, 2.2% growth, this year 2.2%, and next year, happy news, 3.1% growth. The Eurozone, the sick child of the world, we had a real recession in 2013, some recovery in 2014, and a growth which is still relatively low, but for European standards, not too bad, 1.3 next year. Japan, that's another story, that is really in a long period of 25 years of stagnation, the Japanese disease, which some fear would come or could come to Europe. And then if we look at the emerging economies, 4.7 last year, 4.4 this year, more or less status quo, and next year again 5% growth. So if you look at these figures, you would say, well, where's the problem? If you look closely to the US, for example, everything seems quite fine. Here you see GDP growth for the US. We see the cycles, the 7-year cycles more or less, high growth, over optimism, over confidence, and a crash, high growth and a crash, high growth and a crash. This was the crisis of 2008, negative growth of 3%. And now the US, after 1 year, was recovered. And we see here already the forecast, we are gradually going up to 3%. No problem at all. If we look a little bit closer to that US, what are the ingredients of the recovery? Well, a couple of the major elements which were leading to the crisis. The US had a housing bubble before the crisis and a housing crash. Well, here you see the housing prices in the US. The crash was housing prices coming down with about 20%, and in the meantime they have more or less recovered. So everything seems to be under control concerning housing prices. Unemployment was the consequence of the big crisis. Here we see the unemployment figures going up like hell in 2009, up to 10% of the population, and now coming down to 8%. I'm not saying that the quality and the nature of the jobs is the same as before the crisis, but nevertheless there is job creation and unemployment seems to be under control. And then there's the big new thing for the US, energy. Energy was one of the threats and one of the origins of the crisis in 2008. Remember, in 2008, oil prices were at a maximum level never seen before, not even during the oil crisis of the 1980s. Well, suddenly, shale oil, new technology, allows the US, but it's a big question mark if this will become reality, but it seems to be reality. US becoming the biggest energy provider of the world. Here what you see is here the traditional oil reserves. I would like to go back, yes. Traditional oil reserves that's the red area, biggest reserves in Saudi Arabia, 300 billion barrel, and then Iran, 130 billion, Russia 60 billion, Venezuela 80 billion, and only 20 billion for the US. But then you have now technology to make energy out of shale, out of the rocks, and the reserves of the US are estimated at 2,000 billion barrels. So perhaps if this fairy tale becomes a reality, the days of increasing energy prices could be over for a couple of decades. But it's too early to say, but this nevertheless is a very important element, creating potential future growth. So, conclusion, the US seems to be quite under control. Second element is Europe, the sick child of the world economy. Biggest threat and biggest cause for all the unrest in Europe is that the euro could explode, that the European Union could explode, because some of the southern European countries are and were in big trouble. Well, again, if we look now at some markets, it seems all to be under control. For example, here you see the spread on the Greek debt, spread in comparison with the German debt, the 10-year debt. And what we see here that is that while we had the first crisis, 2008, 2009, nothing really happened. So the first big crisis, the housing market, the collapse of the US system, the subprime mortgages, was a non-event for the Eurozone. The event for the Eurozone only came 3 years later, by 2011, when suddenly for Greek, for Spanish, for Italian, for Irish debt, the spread went up from about 6% in comparison with Germany to here in the top end of 2011, more than 40%. That means that all investors in the world declared Greece and Italy and Spain and Ireland and Portugal bankrupt. And then it has, at the end of 2011, there were a number of changes in the monetary policy of Mr. Draghi, printing money, kind of quantitative easing, and what we see is that this whole problem seems to have disappeared. All these countries are back, coming back to the markets, do not need money from the IMF and others, so where's the problem? And if you look at growth figures within the Eurozone, what we see is, again, here, Germany, 0.5 in 2013, 1.4, 1.5, so increasing growth. Not yet the 2 to 3% of the US, but it seems quite okay. France, it's below and behind Germany, and France gradually becomes the sick element within the Eurozone. On the other hand, all the pigs, all the weak countries, what some call the Club Med, the southern countries, Spain, Ireland is not really Club Med, but nevertheless was one of the weak countries because of the crash of the housing market. Greece and Portugal, negative growth in 2013, coming back to positive territory in 2014, with some very nice surprises in the forecast for 2015. Greece growth up to 3%, Ireland 2.5, Portugal 1.5, Spain 1.7. They have growth now forecasted for 2015, clearly higher than Germany. And if we look at the current account, the competitiveness, exports minus import, well, a lot of good news again, a lot of good news. Germany, the motor of exports in Europe, 7% net exports. France, the sick element in Europe, not competitive and negative, so meaning more import than export, and this structurally. And here we see that all these weak countries are back to being competitive. They almost copy, like Ireland, the German attitude. So where's the problem? And then if you look at the emerging economies, well, these economies clearly have some problems in adapting to the new situation. But if we look at the figures, there's nothing spectacularly going on. Here are the BRICS, the new world. If we look at China, 7.7, 7.4, 7.1 in 2015. The days of growth of 10%, double-digit growth, are clearly behind us, but we should not forget that in the meantime, China is not a complete developing country anymore. It has become a powerhouse. So continuing with the growth rate of 10% becomes gradually impossible. Their period of extremely high growth is clearly behind them, but still getting 7% growth is not too bad. Brazil, that's another story. Very low growth, it's really a fallen star. With low growth and high inflation and negative current account, that are the three ingredients which are fatal. No growth, high inflation, and not competitive. It's not the place you want to be. If you look at India, high growth with high inflation and not competitive. Not very nice either. And if we go to Russia, it's a complete disaster. No growth, high inflation, and despite all the energy resources they have, almost no surplus on their current account. So this is the BRICS world, not a catastrophe, but it's very clear that now the BRICS countries, which were considered until 4 years ago as the countries that would take over the world economy, well, they now also have their own problems to resolve, and that creates structural reform, and that creates unrest and uncertainty. Fine. So, if we look further down the road, world economy, again, forecasts of the IMF, a lot of good news. For example, the countries which will have growth of more than 6% according to the IMF, there are about 40 countries in the world for which the IMF forecasts growth above 6%. Where are these countries situated? Well, around Russia and the former USSR, a lot, 11, still in Asia, including China. Latin America, nothing left anymore, it's over for the time being. Middle East, very few, but in Black Africa, 20 countries with a growth of more than 6%. Which means that the world economy is again changing, gets now in another dimension of globalization, with growth engines out of Black Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is more or less the picture of the world. And here you can, for the first time, use your voting devices. Where do you think for the next year we will see the highest growth rates? 4 exotic countries, one a little bit more exotic than another, China, Korea, Kazakhstan, and Brazil. It's up to you to disagree with the IMF. Okay. Results. Kazakhstan seems to be the winner. China 90%, Korea 21%, Kazakhstan 47%, and still some of you still believe in the recovery of Brazil. If I take back the figures of the IMF, what IMF is telling us is China by 2019, so that's the long-term forecast. Be aware of long-term forecasts of economists. Never believe it, that's my disclaimer. But they say China from 7 to 6, Korea around 4 and it remains 4, Kazakhstan today 4.6 up to 5.7. So still below, by 2019, below China, but a rising star. And then Brazil stuck at 2 to 3%. That's the long-term forecast. Never believe it. Now, if you say growth, that's opportunity. We have heard it from the previous speaker, opportunity is nice, but uncertainty is not nice. Losing a customer or winning a customer is opportunity, losing everything or losing the amount of your invoices, that's full loss. So where do you think or where do you expect credit management to be poor in one of the 4? Poorest credit management standards. Brazil does not seem the place to be, no growth, no opportunity and big threat. On the other hand, Kazakhstan, the rising star, but also with relatively poor credit standards, that's a trade-off to be made with all the ingredients of credit management, which are costly, but probably essential in that kind of countries. And then Korea, constant 4% growth and no concerns, no worries about credit standards. And also China seems to be quite okay in your perception. Fine. Now, how did we get to a situation where on the one hand you could say, well, the world economy seems to be quite okay. We see everywhere in Europe recovery, we see high growth in the US, we see some of these emerging countries in trouble, but that's not a threat for the world economy. And at the same time, there is that global feeling of uncertainty, not understanding what is going to happen. It's a very strange paradox. How did we get there? Well, here I'm going to give you my view of why we arrived in this strange situation. And this is my personal view. Don't expect too much academic research about that. It's just a story of what it could well be. And what I think is one of the most important reasons why we get in this situation is that over the last 25 years, we have been living in an economic, financial, and political environment which was extraordinarily positive. That's the good news, and the bad news is that period is over. So why were we in such a very positive environment over the last 25 years? Well, if you look at world history, the same ingredients which have always provoked fast economic growth in the world economy over the last 3,000 years. And one of the most important elements of that is a technological revolution. Our technological revolution, starting in the 60s, 70s, and then coming at full speed by the end of the 80s, is the ICT revolution. The capacity to treat information. What you do as credit manager is treating information. The core of the business is no longer the production. The core of the business becomes getting information and being able to work with information. IT solutions, ICT, IT and communication solutions. And this development of, let's say, computers, to put it bluntly, since the 60s, coming from very big machines making a lot of noise and producing very poor quality data to what we have today at our disposal is a complete technological revolution comparable to the industrial revolution of the 18th, 19th century. And such a revolution has brought us now to the post-industrial world. We are now in the information economics. Power is information, and we see it more and more every day. The world is being completely transformed. Production is not the core and key for success. Information is what drives the world. And every time when we have such technological revolution, it's a challenge for all businesses, because you have to adapt to the new technology and you have to transform the technology, which is an idea, into something that is marketable. You need new products. You need, if you look at the products that today we consider to be essential for our functioning, take mobile phones, take GPS, flat screens, and all you can imagine, all these products. Imagine that you would have to work tomorrow without internet, without email, without e-invoicing, and all these things. You would have the impression that we are back in the Middle Ages. But only 50 years ago, nothing existed. We are just at the start of this movement where everything is driven by information, IT, and all the developments it has. It changes our life, it changes the economy, it allows outsourcing in your businesses. So it changes the total way of how we function, it changes the language we use. This is all about information. And once you have this kind of technological revolution, it's the good news. The good news is you can develop all kinds of new products, all kinds of new business models. It's all things about research and development, thinking outside the box, innovation is driving the new world, because you have this technological revolution. Exactly the same happened in the end of the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution. Remember, until the early 19th century, about 70% of the population in the US and in Europe was working in agriculture. 70%. The Industrial Revolution has led us to a situation where now less than 2% of the population is working in agriculture. And while in the 19th century 70% was working in agriculture, people were starving from time to time. Today we have only 1% farmers in our economy, certainly in the US, and food is abundantly available. This is the nice thing. At the same time, of course, this technological revolution, the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, has destroyed almost 70% of the jobs in the economy of the 18th century. What have we done with all these farmers of the 19th century? They are all disappeared. So if you happen to be a farmer in the beginning of the 19th century, and you know what's happening in the Industrial Revolution, and you have no clue what would be your new job, because there was nothing else. Today we know that instead of growing corn, they were making automobiles and machinery. But in the start of the 19th century, nobody knew what a refrigerator was, because it had to be invented. This is exactly happening today. The technological revolution, all kinds of opportunities, new things that we have to develop from scratch, while the only thing, and we don't know where it will lead us, because it will be a lot of trial and error, while what we know for sure is that more than half of the jobs we have today will disappear in the next 10 to 15 years. And no longer blue-collar jobs, it will be white-collar jobs. So your job is at stake. So this creates an environment of uncertainty at the same time as opportunity. And the big trick will be, how are we going to get the opportunities without creating the disaster of the anxiety? So that's the technological revolution. Every technological revolution leads to political revolution. In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was fundamentally a story of the UK and later on the US. And these two countries, the UK until the Second World War, was really the master of the world, and after the Second World War it became the US, driven by Industrial Revolution developments where they were the first to adapt and to develop all the new products. Now, the technological revolution of these days, ICT, is also and has led to a complete political revolution. And the complete political revolution is that the world order, which existed until the Second World War, is totally destroyed. Remember, until even the years 80s, the world was dominated by the free West. We had three types of countries in the world: the free West, that was Western Europe, Northern America, and Japan, which was part of the West alliance, or not alliance, but the Western part of the world after the Second World War. And then we had the communists. They were behind the Iron Curtain. This country was part of the communist world, which had a totally different way of organizing the economy. And then you had the biggest part of the world population were the underdeveloped. And the underdeveloped were poor, stupid, and cheap. The communists were dangerous. And the free West, that was the nirvana where everybody wanted to be. And the world economy, if you look at it, until the fall of the Iron Curtain, well, was an economy where the free West, representing about 10% of the world population, had access to 80% of the world resources. And 90% of the world population had to do with the 20% remaining. And this was a very nice world for the free West. Now, the technological revolution led in the first round to weakening the communist regimes. Why? Well, if you have a new technology, you need people who invent new things. You need Bill Gates, you need all kinds of people who try certain things, speech technology, and then they fail, and then someone else takes over, and then you have Facebook, and you have Yahoo, and then you have mobile phones. But this is not a very smooth process, It's a process of trial and error. You need hundreds of people to try, only 1% will succeed, but they who succeed, they become the masters of the new world. Well, in a communist planned economy, you don't have that process, because nobody has an incentive to plan, has an incentive to be innovative. Because in such an economy, failure is fatal. An engineer in Russia in the 1970s does not have the idea, what can I do with the ICT today? Because therefore he has to take risk, entrepreneurship. And in a planned economy, if you take risk and you fail, you go to Siberia. So the planned economies miss, like every time in the world economy, in the world history, miss the new opportunity of the new technology. And by the end of the 80s, the planned economies, with Mr. Gorbachev, recognize that they failed, and they say, we have to transform ourselves into a market economy. And that leads to the fall of the Iron Curtain, and that leads to the fact that free markets are considered to be the optimal solution for the world economy, and that leads to deregulation. Suddenly the whole world, with China also saying we want to be part of China, at least a free economy. And India wants to become a free world economy, market economy, and Brazil wants to be a market economy, and suddenly all the borders fall, and you get the World Trade Organization creating one huge global worldwide economy, the times of globalization. Now the globalization was an experiment starting in the 1990s. And suddenly you see lots of strange things. The communists become market economies. Central Europe, long part of the economies of the communist world, becomes Western Europe, or Central Europe, but within the European Union. Underdeveloped economies become emerging markets. Multinational companies can do whatever they want. Outsourcing is the thing of the world, because technology allows you to outsource. And it allows you to outsource services, because production is not that important anymore. So we see a complete change in the activities and in the structure of the world economy. Now this experiment was extremely successful. Extremely successful because the world was very complementary. At the start of globalization, the Western world was expensive and intelligent, and the rest of the world was cheap and stupid. So you had complementarity. And what happened in the first 20 years is all the basic jobs in the Western world are relocated toward Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and even going up to Asia. You get the globalization, relocation of production facilities, leaving Europe and the US and going towards the East. For one simple reason, labor costs. If labor costs in Western Europe are 100, then you can go to Poland, where labor cost is only 20, go to Turkey and labor cost is only 10, and go to China and labor cost is only 5. So all these CEOs of these big multinationals, the only thing they have seen is there is cheap labor. And with cheap labor, we relocate our production to where the cheap labor is, and then we produce there at very cheap prices, and we export what we produce there back to our rich clients. That's why they got the huge bonuses. They could count that labor costs were cheaper. Globalization is not much more than only recognizing cheap labor. When Julius Caesar of the Roman Empire came in our regions 2,000 years ago, he was only looking for cheap labor, and he called that slaves. In the 20th century, we did not need the slaves, because we said the rest of the world, you can do this out of free will. Be happy to work, but only at a fraction of our labor cost. Because we are intelligent and you are stupid. And everybody was happy, because jobs were created. Now, it was already clear from that this was a story that could not continue infinitely. There is a kind of maturity date where this process should be over. But in the meantime, for 25 years, we had really happy days. For example, some of the happy days we had was the question, but if we now want to industrialize China and India and Brazil and Russia, we need huge amounts of capital. Where is this capital going to come from? And the answer was, it will have to come from the Western world, because that's where the capital is. In reality, the new emerging markets did not need our capital. Because if we in the Western world say we save and we have capital, well, what we mean by saving, that is about 10% in Western Europe, 13% of our income. And you have the newcomers, like China. The savings rate in China was in 1990 30% of GDP, and today more than 50% of GDP. So instead of China needing our capital, it's China that is overwhelmed by far too much capital. They don't need our capital. And the result is that Chinese capital is flowing all over the world. If you look these days at the structure of markets, take small countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, look at the port of Antwerp, of Rotterdam, more than 70% is Chinese. Big companies are in the meantime Chinese, or Indian. The whole European steel industry, Mittal, is Indian. And in Belgium we tend to say, well, they will not get Belgium because we have chocolates and we have beer. But in the meantime, our biggest brewery, AB InBev, is Brazilian, and our best chocolates, Godiva, are Turkish. So in the 25 years, it is not the rich West who brought all this capital to the East. It's the East, the emerging countries, that gradually invest in the West. That's not bad, but it's different. For example, when Mr. Mittal in New Delhi decides to close a number of steel mills in Belgium, what are we doing then in Belgium? We organize a strike and a manifestation in Brussels, as if Mr. Mittal in New Delhi is frightened by all these activities. No, his only conclusion is we should get rid of all these things in Belgium because with these people you cannot work. We still do not understand that the world has changed. And when I am speaking to audiences like here, from time to time I ask the question, apropos, what is again the name of the new Chinese president? And then now it starts to come a little bit in the press. But Xi Jinping is a name that nobody is interested in. We seem to forget that according to all economists, today China is the second biggest economy of the world. Within 5 years it will probably be the biggest one. But we are not even interested in understanding what Mr. Xi Jinping wants to do with the world economy, while he represents 1.3 billion people. We know everything about Obama and the shoes of his lady. That's fine, but that will not help us for the next century. We have to understand how the new world functions, with new people and new regions taking over, or at least participating in the world of tomorrow. Okay, what also this period was bringing to us, thanks to cheap labor, not thanks to Mr. Bernanke or Trichet, but to cheap labor, is that everything that was produced in the East, even in Turkey or in Czechia for people in Western Europe, well, became cheaper. That's why you do outsourcing, because it's cheaper. If it's not cheaper, you don't do outsourcing. And you're not going to make an effort to relocate, to create jobs here and in the East if it's not cheaper. So thanks to the cheap labor, you get what we saw also yesterday, the cost of business services comes down. And all these outsourcing devices are only looking for the cheapest place to produce. And if China is too expensive, they go to Vietnam. But then if they continue to the East, they get back in the US and then the game is over. So that's the process that we had over 25 years, but that gradually gets to its end. The result of this cheap labor was inflation is dead. If inflation is dead, interest rates come down. And this is what interest rates did over the last 25 years. German interest rates. Starting at 10 and ending 25 years later at close to 0. Everybody knows if interest rates come down, it means stock markets up, bond markets up, housing prices up, because everybody is rich. And gradually we are addicted to double-digit return, because all this falls just from our mathematical formulas to calculate present value. But now we are at 0. So as an economist, I don't know a lot, but I know that I don't know a lot. But I know that interest rates cannot come down with 10% anymore. They are zero. So if interest rates remain zero, the average return on a portfolio will be zero. And if interest rates go up, the average expected return will be negative. That's a new world. So all those who say, but we are experienced people, 25 years experience, I say this 25 years experience is complete nonsense. Because it's 25 years of experience with this kind of development of interest rates. So throw away your experience of 25 years if you have to live in a world without interest rates coming structurally down. Okay, so in the meantime, other imbalances were growing. For example, in the US. This is the current account of the US. Until the 90s, it's more or less okay, surpluses, negatives, and then we start with globalization, only import. Now how do you finance the import? It's by taking a loan. Where can you find a loan? Well, fortunately, we had the new, this is the capital position of the US, it's a Federal Reserve statistic, which means all the assets of the US abroad minus all the liabilities of the US to the external world. And that was quite okay until the 90s. And then this is what we see. The external debt of the US today is $14,000 billion, 14 trillion. Now who is investing, who is buying all that debt? Well, here you see the Central Bank of China. Foreign reserves in China until 1990, zero. Foreign reserves today already above $4 trillion. In other words, the deficits of the US, and Europe is not better, are financed by countries which we still consider to be stupid, poor, and underdeveloped. At the same time, it's they who finance, who sponsor our debt. And if in China suddenly they say we stop financing the rich West, then it's over. It's as simple as that. Now they are not doing that. They could have some ideas about that. They are not doing that for good reasons. I'll come back to that in 2 minutes. What's far more important is the complementarity. We are rich and intelligent, and they are stupid and poor and cheap. Well, it's over. If you look at the most recent listing in New York, the biggest ever, Alibaba, it's no longer about cheap production and copying products in China. It's about a new generation of Chinese entrepreneurs, supported by Mr. Ping, who say, we want also part of the value added of new technologies. And we will challenge now the Western world with new technologies and new companies. We don't agree that the Facebooks, the Yahoos, the Googles are all American-based. No. Why not try to do it for the whole world, but China-based? And the standards for the future should be Chinese standard, because we are 1.3 billion people, and our best people all have degrees of Harvard or MIT, so why should they not be capable of challenging the Apples of the world, the Googles, the Facebooks, and the whole ICT world, which is now dominated by US and Europe. This is happening now. And that's why we have this kind of crisis. If you go to after 8 years of uncertainty, this is where we are. And the most important step, the graph of my whole presentation, is this one. In 1990, the rich developed world, the advanced economies, still had 70% of the world GDP, and the rest of the world, 90% of the population, 30%. IMF said us last year, it's break-even. The stupid and cheap world is as important as the rich and developed world. And this year is the first year that the stupid and cheap are more important than the advanced. And this is the forecast. The red line will go up to 70, and the blue line will go down to 30. And the question is, how will we adapt the whole infrastructure of the world? That's the big challenge, and that creates all the unrest. This, in my mind, is not a crisis, because a crisis is something where you have a dip, you adapt, and you're back to normal. What we are in is in a regime switch, which means it's not a dip.
It's a complete overhaul of how the world is organized, how it functions, who is at the driving seat, and how will these newcomers behave, and how will the old defensive economies behave politically, socially, financially, and economically. Now, this is that world. But at the same time, remember my introductory slides about the IMF. Everything in the economy seems to be under control. The only thing is the uncertainty about how the world will look like in 5 to 10 years. There we get to the challenges. And I see 4 challenges. 4 challenges that could disturb the marvelous world of the IMF. The first one is geopolitical stress. And I'm not only talking about the Middle East and Islamic State, I'm also talking about Mr. Putin and Ukraine, the fear in the, not as much here, but certainly in the Baltic states, even in Poland, about the uncertainty, what is Russia going to do. They are challenging clearly the masters of the world, certainly the US, and they are challenging Western Europe. You see all kinds of signs how they are trying to do it. For example, a couple of months ago, the 5 presidents of the BRICS country create a parallel road, parallel to the IMF, was the master of the world in financing countries in trouble. Well, they say we will create our own development bank to rival the World Bank and the IMF. But they say, let the Western world do what they want. They created the IMF, but the IMF is only an agent of the US and Western Europe. We create our own World Bank, our own IMF, and we will change the monetary situation of the world. In other words, they say, we don't accept that the dollar and the euro are the major currencies of the world. We want our currency, the yuan renminbi, to be also one of the major currencies of the world. And we want our say at every level of world political, financial, and economic decisions. You cannot blame them. The fact that the military order dominated by the US is over creates everywhere in the world people who take that as an opportunity to try experiments to become autonomous, to challenge the Western world. And you see this map with all the conflicts every year becomes more complex. And conflicts means political risk and means credit risk. What do you think are the biggest risks for the economy? From a geopolitical point of view. And I have just 4 examples. Each of these 4 could happen. If it happens, we cannot say this is a complete surprise. But nobody says that it will happen. Is it EU-Russia, where we will have huge problems? Is it the elections in the US? The midterm elections are behind us, but the next one could again bring surprises. Is it China that's suddenly going to behave towards his neighbors in for the West unacceptable way? Or is it just pure terrorism? Up to you. Wow. Russia seems to be on the top of your minds, followed by China. The US is not important for us anymore. And terrorism, yeah, some, but not really key. So what we are thinking here is it's the old battles of communists against the rest of the world that are going to be dangerous for the world to come. Thanks. Second, my conclusion is I don't think that anything of this will happen. Otherwise, you have to change fundamentally all the forecasts of the IMF. Why is it not going to happen? Because as well China or Russia, they know that the world is globalized. Globalized means interconnected, means that unilateral activities will fire back as a boomerang. And because everybody is hostage of everybody, everybody will behave. Perhaps naive, but that's underlying the assumptions of the IMF. But take care of these assumptions. Second, we have to deleverage. Deleverage means this is the level of debt in the world, which means debt in comparison with GDP. If that goes too high, the probability that all the debt will be orderly repaid becomes very low. We see the level of debt increasing gradually over the last 15 years to now 200% of world GDP. This is already considered to be too high and becoming dangerous. This is Europe. The level of debt is 400% of GDP. That is leading to all the problems in southern countries. Far too much debt. Our economies are funded by debt. Now, what do you think about the probability of a new banking crisis, financial crisis, within the next 2 years? Do you think it's unlikely? That's less than 20% probability. Do you think it's possible? That's number 2, or B, 20 to 50%. Do you think it's likely, 50 to 80%, the next 2 years? A big financial crisis as the one we had in 2008? Or do you think it's almost inevitable? That's 4, more than 80%. Up to you. Pretty optimistic. Pretty optimistic. It is possible, but not likely. And it can certainly be that we don't have any crisis in the next few years. I do agree, even if I would be a little bit more cautious and put a little bit more to the 3 and 4 level. But you are quite optimistic, so that explains why the IMF is relatively optimistic. Normalization of monetary policy. We all know that Europe and the US have only been rescued thanks to printing money. The Federal Reserve, also the ECB. At the same time, we see the new bubbles everywhere. Leveraged loans, leveraged syndicated loans. Stock markets going up in the US, not in Europe, but in the US already. So that are new bubbles. And this monetary policy will have to change, coming back to normal interest rates. That could create new crashes of the bubbles. So that's number 3. Will it happen? It could, but it's not for sure. 4th big risk is the monetary union. Is Europe rescued, or will we really get into more trouble? Again, more countries in trouble, like France, but why not again Spain, again Greece? And that's the question of the political construction of Europe, where a lot of work has been done. This is the big problem of Europe. Unit labor costs since 2000 in Germany have almost not increased. In the rest of Europe, unit labor costs have increased by more than 20 to 30%. This is not sustainable. So we will see if Europe survives. I would say it can survive, but we need political courage. I get out of time, so I have to stop here and go to my conclusions. The world seems quite okay, but there are 4 big assumptions. First, no geopolitical serious stress. Second, deleveraging happens without shocks. 3, monetary policy normalizes without shocks. And 4, the European Union is strong enough to survive all the turmoil. Conclusion, politics are back. The switch from the Western world to the Eastern world is continuing. No matter if you look at the crisis, and here you even don't see a crisis, the developing world continues to grow at 6 to 7%. The advanced economies grow at 1 to 2%. So you see that the map is changing, shifting towards more and more developing countries. This graph says it all. The process of globalization is not broken. We see Southern Africa, we see a lot of things happening, so we are not going to protectionism, what could have been the result of the crisis. This is very good news. But nobody knows how the world will look like in 5 years. And this is the regime switch we are all living in. This is something that was written by Keynes in 1931, comparable situations, big crisis, nobody knows what the world would look like, and this, I think, is an advice to everybody, also in your profession. Keynes was writing in 1931, at the deepest of the dark depression of the 1930s, if we consistently act on optimism, this hypothesis will tend to be realized. But if we act on pessimism and fear, we can keep ourselves forever in the pit of want. 1931, could have been written today. It means don't be pessimistic, it will not help you. So be optimistic. Perhaps later on they will call you naive optimists, but at least it will help you to realize what you dream and what you hope for. Thank you very much.
Again, Andrei Sischka, I'm sorry for that. The economy and the shift is going from west to the east because of relative richness or comparative richness of eastern countries like China, because they got relatively healthy economy. They got, let's say, more money they're buying, they're financing actually west. From my experience of 90s, I was a young man, I always remember that ability of money in pocket does not mean intelligence and culture. Can I ask you for comment in this respect?
Yeah. Well, driving the China growth is certainly not about resources, it's about cheap labor. Cheap labor and a stable political system. And that leads them to have money. But that's exactly what Mr. Xi Jinping is now changing. What he says in the last Communist Party meetings we have had, I saw it on the Belgian television for the first time in my life, a report about the Chinese Communist Party meeting in Beijing, and the news was essentially they are meeting and there's a lot of people. For the rest, nobody was interested in what they were saying. But what they were saying was essentially, we want to change for being known as the cheapest producer for the gadgets of the West. Like all the iPhones and all these material things, they are produced in China. But the value of an iPhone, the 800 euro it costs, is not the production of the machine. The value is the software. And the software is owned by Apple in the US. So we, the Chinese, are the little slaves who work hard to produce the machines to make the Western world rich. Well, we want to change that. We want to change that. So that's a completely other way of thinking. We want to go up to the value chain. And that's what's happened with Alibaba. That's why you see Chinese companies taking over telecom companies in the UK. How they are taking over now the financial companies, some banks, some insurance companies in Europe and in the US. So they want now they are ready to go up to the value chain. So the complementarity between the poor, underdeveloped, and the rich, expensive, is over. Now this is not necessarily bad, it was inevitable. You cannot expect 90% of the world continuous forever to work at 10% of our salaries. You cannot expect that. And now they are at the level to say, well, now the cards are different. So everybody has to adapt. In China, they also have their structural reform needs. They cannot continue to grow at 10%. They are too big. So they have to grow a little bit less fast, 7 to 6, and then to see how socially they can absorb and adapt to this lower growth environment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Peter Daniel. I want to ask you something not from money point of view and not cheap labor point of view, because you were comparing the capital flows and cheap labor and where the money is. But on the other side, I think that why Chinese production is cheaper is not only cheap labor, but it's also, let's say, not so strict regulation of environmental protection. And one day for this cheap production in this big area of China, for this unprotected environment, somebody needs to pay. So how you can see future for this?
Well, again, it's a question of priorities. If you would have been in charge of China 25 years ago, when more than half of the population is still starving, your first goal is food for everybody. That's essentially what they did. You take the environmental damage as collateral damage. Now they are in the phase where environmental issues are in the program of the Communist Party. And for example, Mr. Ping says, within this and 40 years, that's for them the short term. For our companies, the short term is tomorrow, and the long term is the next quarter. Well, their short term is 40 years. Because they don't have energy, and very few shale oil, shale gas, the potential at first sight. Well, what he says is, within this and 40 years, more than half of the Chinese energy will have to come from alternative. Environmental friendly.
Thank you. Do you think that in 40 years future in Chinese areas still there will be something to protect?
Well, we will see, but they are working now on it. And I would not underestimate the capacity of their system, which is a strange mix between ultra-liberal capitalism and strict communism. It's a mix that is very strange. Nobody believed it, that it would be successful, but over 25 years, they have survived every crisis. There is not huge amounts of social unrest, and everybody still believes there about Confucius, not democracy and not human rights. It's not the priority, not even of the Chinese middle class today.
Thank you.